Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, the steep decline in homicides in the United States. Johns Hopkins professor Daniel Webster has studied violence for decades. He speaks with Dr. Josh Sharfstein about what's responsible for the improvement, from the ebbing of the pandemic to policy changes sparked by the 2022 bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Let's listen.
Professor Daniel Webster, so great to have you back on Public Health on Call. I gave you a call because I noticed that homicides in the United States have been falling recently. Can you tell me a little bit about that trend?
Sure, yes. Homicides peaked in 2022. We've seen dramatic reductions, at least dramatic from a year-to-year kind of change, going from 22 to 2023. With approximately, I think it was about a 16% reduction in homicides. The data for 2024 showed a slightly even greater decline. And the year-to-date numbers right now show as much as a 25% reduction in homicides year-to-date in 2025. So the downward slope that we're seeing since the peak in 2022 is quite dramatic. I've been studying gun violence for over 30 years, looking at trends, and it's a cyclical process. But this downward slope that we're seeing right now is among the steepest that I believe I've ever seen.
So let's dig into what may be behind this decline, which is obviously great news. What would be the first place you go?
Yeah, so violence is a complex phenomenon, and of course, there's never one thing. It's usually a convergence of things. We have to start with why gun violence rose so rapidly beginning in the year 2020 with the onset of COVID and a lot of demonstrations and acts of police violence that caused communities to trust police less. And what happened following that is you had both police stepping back, not being as active. Frankly, they stay in their cars. And communities also saying, well, rather than call police who I don't trust, I'm going to try to resolve this issue myself. And sometimes that issue is connected to violence, and it results in what some might call street justice rather than using the regular justice system. Now, during the pandemic years, many systems were disrupted. We know, of course, on the health side of things, those systems were really overloaded. The same occurred for school systems, social services, and also the policing and courts as well. So when all of those things are not functioning, violence just kept going up. Now, we've come out of the pandemic, and many of those systems are coming back to normal.
You think essentially a little bit of a return to normalcy helped reduce the COVID bump in homicides?
Absolutely, yes. And that there's so many different dimensions to that. One is if you're simply more at home, so to speak, and you're someone who is at great risk for violence, the people who are looking for you know where to find you. I mean, it's as simple as that. And we saw some of that during the pandemic. Probably one factor that has been not talked about enough, I think, is actually the decline in alcohol use. We had a huge spike in alcohol use during the pandemic that has subsided some. And alcohol abuse is a clear risk factor for violence. And so you put together, well, I should have mentioned also as part of the rise in gun violence in a couple years after that, we saw historic increases in gun acquisition. And unlike in prior spikes in gun purchases, the people who were buying guns at that time were people who didn't have guns before. So we have a lot more people now who have ready access to guns than we used to. And we had more alcohol use, and we had all these other social disruptions. So all of those things were relevant.
It seems like we're getting closer to where we were pre-pandemic, or are we at where we were pre-pandemic for homicides right now?
Yes, we've actually have lower rates of homicide than pre-pandemic. After the huge increases connected to the pandemic era, we are now around where we were in 2018. So let's start with the Bipartisan Community Safety Act and what changed there as it relates to gun regulations. In my opinion, the most important thing that was done as part of that bill is to expand what kind of sellers of firearms needed to perform background checks before selling those guns. What this law said is that anyone who is selling firearms for a profit, that means they may be advertising them at online sites, they may be going to gun shows. But if you're selling some reasonable number of guns and it looks as though you're doing it for profit, you have to be a licensed dealer. And they, in essence, redefined what it meant to be in the business of selling firearms.
So it became a little harder for people to get guns from someone who didn't have to do a background check.
Exactly. Yes. And that was a really significant thing. Politicians had tried in other eras to pass what we call comprehensive or universal background checks so that all private transfers of firearms would have a background check. But the important thing to know is that it's a volume issue. It's one thing if your neighbor sells you a gun and doesn't do a background check, it's someone you've known for 10 years. But if someone who on a regular basis is selling firearms, advertising on the internet and different sites and going to gun shows every weekend, we're talking about a lot of guns. And if you can switch the rules so that high volume of guns being sold now have to have background checks, record keeping, and all the things that are part of a regulatory system, that's a big deal. So that was one important thing that was done in the Bipartisan Community Safety Act. There were some other more modest things in terms of firearm prohibitions for dating partners who had been convicted of domestic battery, for example. But the thing that became a federal regulation not long after this law was passed had to do with what we refer to as ghost guns. Now, ghost guns really are untraceable guns, and importantly, they've bypassed the whole regulatory process.
These are the guns people can print themselves, essentially, with a 3D printer.
There are two principal ways in which something, in essence, becomes a ghost gun. The most common way actually is through buying kits online, do-it-yourself kits called buy, build, shoot kits. And with many instructions on YouTube or other social media and some reasonable tools that you have available to you, you can order a gun online that you make yourself, and it works like any other firearm. What we saw is an incredible surge in the use of these untraceable ghost guns in crime in cities all across America. I know the data in Baltimore very well, but many other cities were seeing the same phenomenon. And I'll give you some context for Baltimore City, for example. So in 2019, the Baltimore Police Department recovered 34 untraceable ghost guns. Only 3 of those were connected to very specific violent crimes. By 2022, this is only a few years, you have 492 ghost guns recovered by Baltimore police, 114 connected to very specific violent crimes. So that was a huge increase, more than a 13-fold increase in the use of these ghost guns that were going directly to, frankly, people who were prohibited from having them. These were underage youth and felons. I looked at the data myself for Baltimore City. And after the Biden rules on ghost guns, Maryland put in very similar measures in place at the state level around the same time in 2020, late 2022. And then the city actually sued the company that was selling these do-it-yourself kits as well and required them to no longer sell those guns in Maryland. So since then, we've seen after this skyrocketing of use of ghost guns, we're now seeing in 2024, for example, We went from 492 of these guns used in 2022, and now we're at 281 in 2024. More than a 50% increase or decrease as far as crimes of violence involving untraceable ghost guns. In my mind, this was the most significant piece of federal legislation in more than 30 years I've been studying gun policy and gun violence.
So it sounds like you're saying there were some changes that were really due to tincture of time. We passed the pandemic, things normalized, and some of the forces that were causing this huge spike in homicides during COVID went away. But you're also saying this was not just something that happened with time, it was as a result of some policy decisions contributing as well.
Yes, absolutely. So the ghost gun regulations, I think, were key. I think the investments in community violence intervention were key. Similarly, many cities as well as states developed their specific offices of gun violence prevention with a lot of technical assistance to help at the local level. Look, none of this really matters if it doesn't actually trickle down and work at the local level. So we're seeing increased capacity in cities across the country. And of course, the city that I'm most familiar with is Baltimore, where our capacity to address gun violence has been greatly increased over the past 5 years.
And Baltimore is making remarkable progress at the moment.
Yes, the historic reductions we're seeing nationally, Baltimore is seeing even greater reductions, about 2 times as great of reductions in Baltimore. And again, I don't think that's just luck. I think it is due to very focused strategies being implemented well at the local level.
What's your sense of the future?
Yeah, so I guess it's a mixed sense of the future, Josh. One thing I know from studying trends in gun violence is that gun violence acts like a contagion. We're now on the downward slope of that contagion. As each shooting that you prevent, you are actually preventing other shootings down the line. And we're seeing that right now, and it makes me very hopeful about the immediate years ahead. But I'm deeply concerned that those great reductions that we're seeing now could be reversed. Again, I've studied gun violence long enough to see these cycles. And when policies change, when our priorities change, when we take our eye off the ball, all those gains can be lost because, again, gun violence works as a social contagion, so that if gun violence starts to go up a little bit, it can go up very rapidly, very quickly. And some of the Biden era policies are already being reversed by the Trump administration. They've already discontinued all the funding for community violence intervention programs. Other important measures done by the Biden administration was to really beef up the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives capacity to regulate those who sell guns. That is being decimated right now. And I suspect that there will be almost zero attention to that really important task. And people at ATF are now being diverted to work on border security and other sorts of things, rather than try to keep guns out of our communities and the guns that are flow into the underground market.
Professor Webster, well, we hope that these trends continue, and we'll be in touch to talk about it. Thanks so much for joining me.
Okay, thank you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.